People ask me all the time what's the difference between StoryWeaver and Dramatica, two software programs for writing that I had a hand in creating. I was the co-creator of Dramatica, and then 8 years later created StoryWeaver. And of all people, I suppose I'm the one who's best qualified to answer that. But you'd be surprised. While the programs are different, like night and day, people often say to me, I downloaded both demos and they seem pretty much the same. How can they be different? What's different about them? Well, first of all, Dramatica is built around a patented story engine. It's an interactive series of algorithms that were derived from story structure that help you create the perfect structure for your story. Kind of like a Rubik's Cube of story structure. You answer a few questions, and as you do, it calculates the dramatic impact of those things that you want to do, your dramatic intent, and then it says because you've pulled a piece this way, it's also pulled these things with it. And it tells you if you want to support what you're doing, you also have to have these pieces. And you don't want to go off on that track because it's working contrary to what you've already stated as your dramatic intent. So simply, story engine, Rubik's Cube, answer a few questions, gives you perfect story structure. Now, StoryWeaver was made 8 years afterwards. After co-creating Dramatica, I looked at it and I said, that's an intellectual pursuit, an analytic activity, and a lot of people want to come from inspiration. Dramatica's great if you already know what your story's about because then you can find the perfect structure in it. But what if you haven't got a clue? Well, how about those people who are seeking inspiration? They want to develop their story's world, who's in it, what happens to them, and what it all means. And that's where StoryWeaver was created. Using what I knew about Dramatica and the theory of story structure behind it, I fashioned a new program, StoryWeaver, that doesn't have any theory in it at all. Instead, it looks at the author rather than looking at the story. And it says, what does an author go through? What are the steps an author goes through in trying to be creative? And how can we support that? How can we create something that will lead the author without forcing them down a path they don't want to go? And so I realized there are 4 different stages in story structure. The first one is inspiration, when you're coming up with your initial ideas. It's what makes you want to write a story in the first place, whether it's a bit of dialogue, a scene that you'd like to see in a plot, something going on, a thematic point you'd like to explore, whatever, subject matter. That's your inspiration. And it's going to have an aspect of character, plot, theme, and genre. Then you're going to move on into development, where you take those initial inspirations and you fill in the gaps between them, kind of like a thunderhead forming out of a bunch of disparate clouds. You create the connective material, you add depth, you add breadth, you add nuance, and you make them all work together, all these little pieces of inspiration, and exclude those that don't. Having gone through development, you move into the exposition stage. And in exposition, that's where you're going to be working on, you know what your story's about now. You've got it all worked out. But how are you going to explain that to your audience or reader who hasn't got a clue? They only know what you tell them. So you have to work on an exposition plan. And finally, you go into expression or storytelling, where you figure out, now I know what I'm going to tell them and when I'm going to tell it to them, but how am I going to say it? How am I going to drop this information? What tone will I take? What manner will I use in expressing these things I know about my story that I have to tell my audience at this particular time? And so, on the one hand, Dramatica is all about the mechanics of story structure and making sure that you can answer questions where it will tell you, if you're analyzing something you've already written, you're going off path from what you've stated you want to do. You start with what's most interesting to you and say, this is the part of the story that I absolutely want to keep the most. And you answer questions about that structurally. And when you do, it'll cross-reference that information and say, now that you're getting down into some of the stuff that you're not so married to, you actually started to drift and you're losing track of what your argument is. You're not supporting yourself as strongly as you could. Or you've missed a piece, you've left out a step, you've got a chunk of consideration where people would say, why didn't they think of doing that? Anybody would think of doing that. You ever see a movie like that or read a book where you say, he wouldn't do that, he's not that kind of guy, or why didn't anybody think of doing this? Somebody would have, okay? That's what Dramatica helps you with. And then on the other side, over here, left, right, looking at the video. With the other side over here, you're dealing with StoryWeaver, and StoryWeaver is telling you, through 200 questions, let's go through inspiration and development and exposition and expression, and it will actually ask you questions that it will quote later for future questions. So if you do some work, it'll say, all right, now here's this new question. Look at the answers you gave to these other questions or the work that you've previously done on these other questions, and take that and consider it and blend it together with what you're doing, refer to it, make these pieces work together. So you're constantly folding in what you do. And that way you deal with your people of your story before they become characters. You deal with what they're doing before it becomes plot. You're dealing with what their value standards are that they're exploring, their morals and their attitudes towards things before it becomes your theme. And you deal with the world you want to write about before it becomes your genre. So night and day. On the one side, Dramatica, mechanics of story structure, dealing with the Rubik's Cube of the relationships among underlying structural elements below the level of subject matter that will cross-reference everything you say about your story and then project what you actually need to complete that, or find you in the analytic process and say you've actually moved away from what you intended to do and you're undermining your own argument. And then on the StoryWeaver side, purely inspiration, dealing with the muse, coming up with ideas, filling them out and expanding them, always with character, plot, theme, genre in mind, moving on to expression and then moving on to exposition and then into expression. So Dramatica, it's pretty complex. The patent, the engine, took 3 years to build. That's why it costs between $150 and $200 currently on the market. Whereas StoryWeaver is just a series of things I learned that take you step by step through those 4 stages of story development, and therefore it's a very simple program. Didn't take a lot of development. Once I'd figured it out, it's only $29.95 currently. So again, visit us at storymind.com. You can see more videos like this about all aspects of story structure and storytelling, and you can download free demos of StoryWeaver or Dramatica. That's it for now.